Before We Die of Silence, Chapter 1, Winter Stations, when he called after 22 years, she almost let the machine take it. The phone rang 4 times while she stood at the kitchen counter holding a knife above an uncut pear. Evening light rested across the room in long amber strips. She watched the answering machine blink once, then twice. Then his voice arrived, older but unmistakable. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I'm in your city." The knife slipped from her hand and struck the floor point first. For several seconds, she did not move. The refrigerator hummed behind her. Somewhere upstairs, the Henderson boy practiced scales badly on a trumpet. The sound drifted through the ceiling in uneven bursts, ordinary sounds. A life continuing. She bent slowly to retrieve the knife. The machine clicked. "I know this is unfair," Julian said. "I know the hour is unfair too. A pause, breath against the receiver. I didn't want to leave without hearing your voice once." The message ended there. No number. No explanation. Only silence returning to the kitchen like something patient. Eleanor stood at the counter until the light disappeared from the room entirely. Then she reached for the pear again, though she was no longer hungry. Her husband came home at 7:30, carrying the cold in with him. Martin always entered quietly despite his size. 40 years of teaching history to restless adolescents had given him the habit of conserving energy wherever possible. He removed his scarf, hung his coat, kissed her cheek. "You didn't turn the lamps on." "I forgot." "You never forget." She smiled at that, but only with her mouth. Martin studied her a moment longer before walking into the kitchen. He smelled faintly of snow and old books. Even now, after 38 years of marriage, Eleanor associated that scent with safety. "You eat?" he asked. "Not yet. I brought bread." He lifted a paper bag slightly as proof. She watched his hands while he unpacked groceries onto the counter. Thick hands now. Veined. Slower than they once were. Once, long ago, she had loved those hands because they seemed capable of building a life from nothing. Later, she loved them because they held their children carefully. Later still, because they steadied her mother, while dementia erased the woman piece by piece. Love changed shape when it survived long enough. "You're tired," he said. "It was a long day." "You say that every Thursday?" "That's because every Thursday is terrible." He laughed softly. The familiar rhythm of it loosened something in her chest and tightened something else. Martin taught until retirement, but retirement had failed to take. Now he worked 3 afternoons a week at the historical archive downtown, restoring documents no one else had patience for. Eleanor sometimes suspected he preferred dead centuries to the living one. "What did you do today?" he asked. 3 client meetings, 1 panic attack, a leak in the ceiling. Productive. The leak or the panic attack. Depends which one cost more. She smiled again. This time it reached her eyes for a second. Then the phone rang. Both of them looked toward the hallway. Once. Twice. Twice. Martin reached it first. "Hello?" Eleanor felt her body go still before her mind understood why. "Yes, she's here." A pause. Then Martin turned slightly, holding the receiver out toward her. "It's for you." She wiped her hands on a towel, though they were dry. "Hello?" For a moment, nothing. Then Julian said, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have called twice." She closed her eyes. Martin had already returned to the kitchen. She could hear drawers opening, plates touching. "Where are you?" she asked quietly. "At the Belmont Hotel. That place still exists, apparently against all reason." Despite herself, she almost smiled. Outside, a car moved slowly through slush beneath the window. Headlights slid across the ceiling and vanished. "I heard about your daughter," Julian said. The words entered the room carefully. Eleanor leaned against the wall. "Who told you?" "David Klein." "You still speak to David?" "Not often." "She's better now," Eleanor said. "Mostly." "I'm glad." Another silence. Not empty. Crowded. 22 years ago, silence between them had felt charged with anticipation. Now it felt archaeological. Layers beneath layers. "You should go eat dinner," Julian said finally. "Yes." "I only wanted—" He stopped. In the kitchen, Martin was humming under his breath while opening the bread. Eleanor listened to it. "What did you want?" she asked. Julian exhaled softly into the phone. "I wanted to know if hearing my voice still ruined your evening." Her throat tightened with such sudden force, she had to press her hand against it. That's a cruel question. I know. And I needed the answer anyway. She stared into the darkened living room. Yes, she said at last. A long pause followed. Then, very softly, Julian laughed. Not with victory, not even with pleasure. With recognition. I thought so, he said, and hung up. Martin buttered bread while she set the table. Neither mentioned the phone call immediately. Their marriage had acquired over decades a careful architecture around difficult subjects. They approached pain indirectly, like elderly people descending ice-covered steps. Finally, Martin said, an old friend? Yes. Anyone I know? No. The lie arrived smoothly. That frightened her. Martin nodded once. From Chicago? Yes. Another lie. He carried the soup pot to the table and sat across from her. Steam rose between them. Lentils, carrots, rosemary. January food. You're pale, he said. I'm fine. You're somewhere else. No more than usual. He looked at her then with that expression she had never fully learned to endure, patient concern mixed with intelligence. Martin noticed more than people believed. What happened to your hand? She looked down. The knife had nicked her palm earlier. A thin red line crossed the skin near her thumb. Cooking accident. He reached gently across the table and turned her hand upward. His fingers were warm. You should clean it properly. It's nothing. Most damage begins as nothing. She met his eyes then. There were marriages built on passion, others on admiration. Theirs had been built largely on endurance and decency, which sounded tragic when said aloud, though it had not felt tragic most days. Martin released her hand. They ate quietly after that. Outside, snow began again. That night, Eleanor woke at 2:14 to find the other side of the bed empty. For one disoriented second, she thought Martin had left. Then she heard the faint creak of floorboards downstairs. She wrapped a robe around herself and followed the sound into the kitchen. Martin sat alone at the table in darkness, except for the stove light. A mug rested untouched beside him. You all right? She asked. He looked up. Yes. Couldn't sleep. You should have woken me. You were sleeping peacefully for once. She leaned against the doorway. What are you doing down here in the dark? Thinking. That sounds dangerous. It usually is. He smiled faintly, then gestured toward the kettle. Tea? No. But she sat anyway. The house settled around them with old familiar noises. Pipes ticking. Wind against the siding. Finally, Martin said, Do you remember the hotel in Montreal? The question startled her. Which hotel? The small one near the river. Our anniversary trip. Snowstorm. That was 30 years ago. 31. You kept track. I kept you alive during food poisoning in a foreign country. It leaves an impression. She laughed softly before she could stop herself. I remember the curtains, she said. Green velvet. And terrible wine. And you insisting your French was better than the waiter's English? It was. It absolutely was not. He smiled into the dim kitchen. Then the smile faded. I miss you sometimes, he said quietly. The sentence landed between them with terrifying gentleness. Eleanor looked at him carefully. I'm sitting right here. I know. He folded his hands together. But there are versions of people that disappear while the body keeps moving. Neither spoke after that. A car passed outside. Light moved briefly across the ceiling. Finally, Eleanor asked, Why are we talking like this tonight? Martin considered the question. Then, with devastating calm, he said, Because whoever called earlier made you look 20 years younger and infinitely sadder. Her breath stopped. He did not look angry. That would have been easier. Only tired. How long have you known? She asked. Knew what? That there was someone before you? Martin gave a small, almost invisible shrug. There's always someone before someone. That isn't an answer? No. He stood then and carried his untouched tea to the sink. You never said his name in your sleep, he said quietly. I suppose I should be grateful for that. She stared at him. Martin, I'm not asking questions tonight. He rinsed the mug slowly beneath hot water. I'm too old to begin interrogating ghosts. She did not sleep again. At dawn, she dressed quietly and walked 6 blocks through fresh snow to the river. The city looked blurred at that hour, half erased. Traffic sparse. Storefronts dark. She stopped beneath the old iron bridge where gulls wheeled above black water. Julian had once kissed her there in February with snow melting in her hair. No, not there exactly. Another bridge, another city. Still her body remembered before her mind corrected it. Memory was humiliating that way. She stood with her gloved hands in her pockets watching the current move beneath ice. You always come to water when you're upset. The voice behind her was older now, roof-end. But the cadence remained unchanged. She turned slowly. Julian stood several feet away in a charcoal coat dusted white at the shoulders. His hair had gone almost entirely silver. The sight of it hurt her unexpectedly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor said, "Following women at dawn seems beneath you." "I took a chance. You always did." He smiled slightly. Age had altered him unevenly. Time had thinned his face, but deepened his presence. He looked less handsome than before and more dangerous because of it, as if charm had finally burned away, leaving only honesty. "You cut your hair," he said. "So did you. I had less choice." Snow drifted between them. Eleanor realized suddenly that her hands were trembling inside her pockets. "You shouldn't be here." "I know. Then why are you?" He looked toward the river instead of at her. "My brother died in November." The words changed the air immediately. She softened without meaning to. "I didn't know. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't tell anyone. I'm sorry." He nodded once. "For some reason," he said, "it made me intolerant of unfinished things." She understood at once and hated herself for understanding. "Julian, I'm not asking you for anything." That sounds exactly like the kind of sentence people say before asking for everything. At that, he laughed quietly. Got it, she remembered that laugh. Not the sound itself, the feeling of causing it. "You still do that," he said. "Do what?" "Turn frightened when something matters." Anger flashed through her then, swift and defensive. "You disappeared." "Yes." "You married someone else." "Yes." "You let 22 years pass." "I know." The river moved heavily beneath the bridge. Julian looked at her finally. "I thought staying away was the moral choice. And now?" "Now I think morality is sometimes just cowardice wearing good manners." The sentence entered her like cold water. Eleanor looked away first. Across the river, church bells began striking 8. "You can't come into my life now," she said quietly. "I never really left it." "That's arrogant." "That's true." She should have walked away then. Instead, she asked the question she had no right to ask. "Were you happy?" Julian's face changed almost imperceptibly. "With my wife? Yes. She died 3 years ago." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "I didn't know that either." "No. Were you happy?" she repeated. He considered the question with painful seriousness. "At times," he said, "honestly, at times." It was the honestly that wounded her. Had he said no, she could have hated him safely. Snow collected on the shoulders of his coat. "What about you?" he asked. She almost answered automatically. "Yes, of course. I built a good life. I loved my husband. We raised children. We survived illnesses and mortgages and funerals and all the ordinary catastrophes." Instead, she heard herself say, "I don't know." Julian looked at her with an expression so unguarded it frightened her more than desire would have. A man jogging along the river path between them briefly. When he was gone, the moment had altered, the world returning. Eleanor stepped backward. "I have to go." "Will I see you again?" "No." The lie hung visible in the freezing air. Julian nodded as though accepting terms neither of them believed. Then he reached into his coat pocket and held out a small object, a key. "The hotel room," he said, "in case you decide honesty deserves one afternoon before we die." She stared at the key in his open hand. Neither moved. Far above them, gulls turned slowly over the river in whiting white circles. And, after a long moment, Eleanor stepped forward enough to take it.